Good evening. Hello. I'm Sandra Peart, Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and on behalf of the faculty, students, and staff of the school, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the third in our series on Into the Fray, Global Perspectives on Conflict. This evening, as part of that series, we're hosting the James McGregor Burns Lecture on Biography, and I'd like to thank our co-sponsors in the Department of History for collaborating with us for this event. It's now my pleasure to introduce one of our many extraordinary students at the Jepson School, Hannah Liedl. Hannah is a senior from Nashville who double majors in leadership studies and international studies with the concentration in world politics and diplomacy. She's very interested in public education, and last summer she interned with communities and schools of Richmond. She's currently interning with the Middle School Renaissance 2020 project as it kicks off its pilot to provide quality after-school experiences for middle school students in the Richmond public schools. Her Jepson School thesis investigates the structural and institutional forces that affect public schooling in Richmond. We're very proud of Hannah. Please welcome Hannah to the stage as she introduces our speaker this evening.
Thank you, Dean Peart. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My time in the Jepson School has been filled with classes that raise questions about power, justice, equality, and social change. These courses have cultivated in me a deep interest in disenfranchisement, discrimination, and disparities in educational opportunities in particular, issues that are inextricable from the history of race relations in the United States. As a result, I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce to you tonight our speaker, Dr. Robert J. Norrell. Dr. Norrell is an expert on United States race relations and has written extensively on the American South. An Alabama native, Dr. Norrell earned his BA and PhD from the University of Virginia. He is currently a professor of history at the University of Tennessee, where he holds the Bernadette Schmidt Chair of Excellence. From 1984 to 1985, he completed the Mellon Research Fellowship in American History at the University of Cambridge. And the following year, he was presented with the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award for his publication titled Reaping the Whirlwind, The Civil Rights Movement in Tuskegee. Among a variety of other recognitions and accomplishments, Dr. Norrell has published numerous books about the history of race relations in the United States. In 2009, he published a book titled Up From History, The Life of Booker T. Washington, that was recognized by the Washington Post and Library Journal as the best book of the year. Contrasting the change-promoting leadership of W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, the book serves as the foundation for tonight's lecture. Praised for his honest and nuanced understanding of how both leaders operated within the context of their time, Dr. Norrell presents a compelling analysis of the competing leadership styles of the two historical figures. Without further ado, please welcome me in joining Dr. Robert J. Norrell.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. It's a great delight to have such a nice, fulsome introduction from somebody who's not some old worn-out college professor like me. So thank you, Hannah, for those generous words. It reminds me. Uh-oh. Okay. Any? I'm too tall. Do you think it will move? All right. I don't have a very strong voice, and I learned tonight at dinner I have a familial tremor from the house physician here, Charlie Bryan. So I have to drink water. So my hands will shake. Don't worry. I probably won't fall off the podium. The introduction that Hannah so generously gave reminds me of a story about one of Booker Washington's political allies, that was William Howard Taft. Booker would write letters and refer to President Taft, his ally in the Republican Party, as our big friend. And those of you who are students of American history know that President Taft was the heaviest man ever to occupy the White House. He had a figure something like the governor of New Jersey, or like the governor of New Jersey used to look like before he had weight reduction surgery. My wife still calls him Poke Chop. President Taft was called upon to give a talk at a banquet in New York, where he was introduced by a man named Chauncey Depew. Now, Chauncey Depew was a prominent New York politician and a fellow who spent a lot of time at banquets and really enjoyed hearing himself talk. And this one night, he went to the podium to introduce President Taft, and he went on for some 45 minutes about the great virtues of President Taft, and he concluded by saying, I give to you a man pregnant with honor, pregnant with integrity, pregnant with intelligence, President William Howard Taft. And Taft waddled to the podium, and to his credit, he was a man, as this cliche says, he was comfortable in his own quite voluminous skin, and he wasn't bothered or insulted too much, but he gave Chauncey Depew a sidelong look before he folded his hands across his great girth and looked down at it tenderly and said, if it's a boy, I'll name him George Washington Taft. He looked again and he said, but if it's a girl, I'll name her Martha Washington Taft. But if I suspect it's merely gas, I'm going to name it Chauncey Depew Taft. So thank you very much, Hannah, for that lovely introduction. Booker Washington made his reputation in part as a leader, initially as a public speaker, and his success at the podium was based a lot on his humor. He adapted an old white joke about the affinity between blacks and mules, noting from the podium the absence of mules in the vicinity that night, and then saying, I feel lonesome tonight. His audiences laughed at that. Much of his humor, though, was a satire of whites, very subtle, I think. On the social conditions in the South, Booker often said, the colored men down south are very fond of an old song entitled, Give Me Jesus and You Take the Rest. And the white man has, in fact, done that very thing. Taken him at his word. He told the story of a white man who asked a black fellow to loan him 3 cents for the fare for a ferry across a river, to which the black man replies, boss, it seems like a man who ain't got no 3 cents just as well off on one side of the river as the other. So he was a very attractive man at the podium. Tonight I'm going to try to do 4 things. I'm going to be serious from now on. I'll address the problems of judging Booker Washington's and W.E.B. Du Bois's leadership, because judgment depends on the historical record. And the historical record since the 1960s on these 2 men has been skewed heavily in favor of Du Bois's leadership and overwhelmingly against Washington's. Second, I'll examine both men's goals in their leadership. Third, I'll offer an assessment of what each man actually achieved with his leadership. And finally, I'll place each man's leadership in a longer historical context and compare their works to other leaders in American history. Washington emerged as the leader of African Americans after he gave a speech at the Cotton States Exposition in Atlanta in 1895. The passages of the speech that are typically quoted are, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers in the hand, yet one as the hand, in all things essential to mutual progress." And the other one was a statement, "The agitation of questions of social equality is the extremist folly." Each has been interpreted in the many years, 120 years since that speech, as demonstrating that Washington was a toady to white supremacists. But the remainder of the text of that famous speech acknowledges certain things, particularly the ugly racial images then projected in the popular culture about blacks in the 1890s and the corresponding prejudices that whites held against blacks. Washington believed that the white mind needed to have different images of blacks from the evil, beast-like reputation that had become embedded in the white mind about blacks since emancipation, as whites insisted that in freedom, former slaves had declined in character and morality. Washington said blacks were a people of love and fidelity to white people, that they were faithful and law-abiding, and those two things contradicted the contemporary opinion that blacks were idle, criminal, and hostile to whites. Washington called for blacks to focus on economic improvements through education, trades, and improved farming. Blacks had to help themselves, Washington said, through hard work and good relations with whites. The overarching message in Atlanta was a prophecy of black progress, of movement forward and upward for black people, and of interracial peace, and that is not in how this speech has subsequently been interpreted. At the same time that he is carrying forward this message of interracial peace, Washington was conducting a public relations campaign to change the black image. And in the next 2 decades, at the same time he was doing the sort of PR stuff, he was also making protests in the media against lynching, discrimination on railroads, unfair voting qualifications, discriminatory funding in education, segregated housing, and discrimination by labor unions. In other words, he was carrying on at the same time an active program of protesting in his positive way the wrongs being done to blacks at the time. At the same time he was doing that, he arranged and financed an extensive legal campaign against the various forms of the Jim Crow system. Court suits against disfranchisement, against peonage, against discrimination on juries, and in public accommodations. He arranged the court cases secretly in the belief that public knowledge of his challenges would project an aggressive image of blacks and probably jeopardize his safety and the existence of his institution, Tuskegee Institute. There's a fundamental similarity between Washington's actions and the protest agenda that would be put forward in 1909 by the NAACP, which would make the same protest against segregated public accommodations, lynching, and the criminal justice system, economic discrimination, and of course it would bring legal cases in all of those areas. It would also condemn the ugly images projected about blacks in American life, starting with the 1915 film Birth of a Nation. Washington's anticipation of virtually the entire NAACP agenda suggests that a consensus of what was needed to be done to protect black rights had been identified as early as 1895, and he and the NAACP had pursued it in turn. But the similarity has been lost to the historical record. How and why did this fundamental continuity between Washington and the NAACP come about? In The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois declared that Washington was a black leader chosen by whites, having won their favor in the 1895 speech, which Du Bois dubbed the Atlanta Compromise, because Washington allegedly had surrendered civil and political rights for economic opportunities. The Atlanta Compromise would prove to be an enduring pejorative. In fact, Washington was selected in much the same fashion as Frederick Douglass before him and Martin Luther King afterward, a powerful voice who got the attention of whites. At the same time, he earned the respect and admiration of the black masses by helping them imagine a better future. The conflict between Washington and Du Bois has been universally explained as an ideological clash between an accommodationist to segregation and a man committed, and that's Washington, and a man committed to protest. David Lewis, Du Bois's admiring biographer, writes that in fact their alienation was personal before it was ideological. Du Bois privately complimented Washington's racial diplomacy in Atlanta in 1895 and supported Washington's race leadership for the 5 years or so after that. Washington offered Du Bois jobs in Tuskegee, and some of which Du Bois took. But in 1900, Du Bois suspected that Booker did not fulfill a promise to support him for a position at the Washington, D.C. school system. I think that beyond the personal grievance, by 1901, Du Bois simply did not think Washington should be the leader of the race. One of the common perils of leadership, it seems to me, is that the leader's faction has power and the outsiders don't. Or opposition emerges because the leader in power manifests qualities that some on the outside dislike, and certainly that's the case here. Washington was not Du Bois's kind of person. Washington was a fellow with about a middle school education who was as careful as he could be to get along with whites. By 1903, Du Bois agreed with a minority of middle-class black intellectuals in the North that as leader, that Washington as leader should be protesting all the wrongs all of the time. Living in the Deep South, Washington knew he could not get away with that. With the loss of voting rights and the expansion of Jim Crow, conditions for blacks were declining, and at some level, that was Washington's real problem. The Herbert Hoover example seems relevant. The one in charge, when things go to hell, gets blamed, whether or not he had anything to do with the trouble. That, I believe, this part explains the fate of Booker Washington. In Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois said Washington, quote, practically accepted the alleged inferiority of the Negro races and asked blacks to forego political power, civil rights, and higher education, none of which was true. And Du Bois knew it. Du Bois understood precisely why Washington said what he had in Atlanta. Du Bois failed to note his own earlier support for Washington's leadership or to explain why he had changed his mind to put the speech in such a negative light. He knew that Booker had neither accepted inferiority nor relinquished political or civil rights because Du Bois had worked closely with Washington to challenge railroad discrimination and voter disfranchisement in Georgia. Du Bois surely saw that Washington understood that blacks already had lost on voting rights and public accommodations, but by the time Washington inherited the leadership of the race, and that Washington was now, after 1900, fighting a rearguard action to keep southern states from abolishing all public education, which was a common goal of many white politicians at that time. Du Bois had witnessed the hysteria surrounding a horrific 1899 lynching near Atlanta and surely could imagine the possibility of terrorism aimed at Tuskegee or Washington himself if he spoke out too much. Yet Du Bois extended no sympathy to Booker for the precariousness of his existence. Du Bois pushed relentlessly the red herring that Washington opposed all higher education. He knew of Washington's support for Fisk University, a liberal arts college. He knew of Washington's preference for hiring teachers from good liberal arts schools, and Washington's frequently stated position that higher education was entirely appropriate for blacks who could put it to use. It was purely partisan of Du Bois not to acknowledge that Washington's public posture was intended to diffuse white hysteria. If Du Bois did not understand the purpose of the propaganda of interracial peace, he may have been the only black man in the South in 1903 so obtuse. And of course, there was nothing dim-witted about W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois surely knew of the attacks that pelted Washington after Theodore Roosevelt invited him to dinner at the White House in 1901 to discuss patronage appointments in the South. After that, or in response to that, Senator Ben Tillman of South Carolina said Roosevelt and Washington had committed an act so obnoxious that it would require, lynching 1,000 niggers in the South before they will learn their place again. A popular song that after the White House dinner on the vaudeville stage instantly appeared. And the lyrics were, "Coon, coon, coon, Booker Washington is his name. I think I'd class Mr. Roosevelt with a coon, coon, coon." The memory of the White House dinner did not die. 2 years later, Governor James Vardaman of Mississippi insisted that the White House was quite, quote, "so saturated with the odor of the nigger that the rats have taken refuge in the stable." Du Bois could not have missed the white South's hatred of Washington. Two historians who knew well the context of Washington's life were most influential in shaping the negative view of Washington's leadership. Du Bois's views reverberated through C. Vann Woodward's 1951 Origins of the New South, most influential book by far still 60 years later, on the history of the South, which adapted Du Bois's pejorative of the Atlanta Compromise and repeated his blame, Du Bois's blame for disfranchisement onto Washington. Woodward did not acknowledge the intense demonization of black character that preoccupied Washington, nor did he recognize the public relations strategy that Washington was pursuing. Woodward had to know that Booker was fighting a defensive battle to save black education from official abandonment, or that much black education would not have existed except for the Northern philanthropy that Washington promoted. But in Woodward's view, Washington was guilty of perpetrating the fraudulent New South by his collaboration with Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Collis P. Huntington, all of whom admired Booker's ability, common with their own, to build a great enterprise, except, of course, Booker had executed it with the considerable handicap of being black. Woodward's anti-business views compelled him to condemn the friend of the capitalist villains in his master narrative. Woodward may not have known about Washington's secret challenges to segregation, but he surely knew that by the time Washington made public statements about voting, which he always upheld, black voting, that disfranchisement was an unstoppable movement in the South. Woodward wrote about Vardaman and Tillman, but ignored the curses that they made against Washington, leaving the impression that Booker had more freedom to speak and act than he actually did. Woodward ignored Washington's efforts to bolster black morale and was silent on Tuskegee as a symbol of black achievement and competence. Woodward's student, Lewis Harlan, author of a celebrated biography of Washington and the 14 volumes of the Booker T. Washington Papers, condemned Washington as, quote, master of the Tuskegee plantation. Harlan flung epithets at Washington. He was a minotaur, a lion, a fox, or Brer Rabbit, some frightened little man like the Wizard of Oz. If we could remove those layers of secrecy as one peels an onion. Perhaps at the center of Washington's being would be revealed a person with a single-minded concern with power. Harlan originally, he wrote about this, originally thought of Washington as an Uncle Tom. But then he found out about all of the secret lawsuits, and then writing in the early 70s, Harlan said, Washington's secret ways put him in mind of, guess who? Richard Nixon. Harlan made Washington's, quote, dirty tricks and his mealy-mouthed moderation in the face of racial injustice. Harlan was channeling Spiro Agnew there into the main theme of his biography. Instead of putting Washington's actions in the context of groups competing for power, Southern blacks versus Southern whites, Southern blacks versus Northern blacks, and Southern blacks in pursuit of Northern help, Harlan situated Washington and Du Bois in a simple struggle between Northern black idealists of distinction and dignity, Du Bois, and the power-hungry wizard of Tuskegee. Harlan chose not to show the mounting white hysteria about Washington's role in politics. He mostly ignored the impact of the White House dinner. He did not discuss the attacks made by Vardaman or Tillman or that of Tom Heflin or Thomas Dixon. In 1904, Tom Heflin, the congressman who represented Tuskegee, threatened Washington with lynching in the Tuskegee courthouse. Thomas Dixon, author of the wildly popular racist fiction, including the Leopard Spots and the Klansman, said Booker was preparing blacks not to work for white men, but was, quote, training them all to be masters of men, to be independent, to own and operate their own industries, and in every shape and form destroy the last vestige of dependence on the white man for anything. Dixon was, of course, right, although Washington would never have admitted it openly. Dixon asked, would the Southern white man allow the Negro, quote, to master his industrial system, take the bread from his mouth, or would he do exactly what his white neighbor in the North does when the Negro threatens his bread? Kill him. He was right about that, too. Harlan neglected the intensifying opposition to black education, even though Harlan himself had written an earlier book on the declining support for it. So, enough about old historians. Strong leaders inevitably must deal with criticism. Washington made a policy of not responding publicly to criticism. He explained privately, if a charge is made today and I deny it, and another false one is made tomorrow and I fail to deny it, people will reason that because I denied the first one and failed to deny the second one, that the second is true. And so I should be in continual controversy and hot water. He quoted Oliver Wendell Holmes. Controversy equalizes wise men and fools, and the fools know it. But I believe and have written that the policy of avoiding controversy, though generally shrewd for that time, was wrong in a few cases. In 1906, Theodore Roosevelt betrayed Booker by court-martialing a group of black soldiers wrongly charged with rioting and violence in Brownsville, Texas. And then Roosevelt ignored Booker's pleas to let Booker, investigate the incident because he knew the truth had come out. Washington should have taken Roosevelt to task publicly because the incident severely damaged his leadership among blacks. On the other hand, Booker answered the criticism of Northern blacks led by William Monroe Trotter, not publicly, but by scheming quietly against Trotter and others, when in fact his detractors did not amount to much, and the action distracted Booker. Washington seemed to believe that all blacks should support his leadership of the race when so much power was arrayed against them. I think that was an unrealistic, if understandable, expectation of solidarity. Leaders in significant positions inevitably will have critics. The posthumous attack on Washington's leadership coincided, came in the 1960s and 70s, with the Civil Rights Movement, which caused a rethinking of racial strategies, and any approach other than the direct action protests came to be viewed as illegitimate. At first, Martin Luther King Jr. invoked Washington's memory as a moral authority for King's ethic of love and his posture of passive resistance to hatred, white hatred. King quoted Washington saying, "Let no man pull you so low as to make you hate him." He did that in speeches. He did it in Stride Toward Freedom. As direct resistance to segregation accelerated starting in 1960, Du Bois's life became a paradigm of correct black leadership, the pure exponent of protest, and Booker was dispatched to the opposite pole from which right-thinking Americans had to be repelled. Younger blacks began to condemn Booker. John Lewis, chairman of SNCC, said that Washington was, quote, ridiculed and vilified by his own people for working so closely with white America, an assertion true for only a tiny minority of blacks during Booker's life, but a mounting majority of blacks during Lewis's life. By 1963, King had revised how he interpreted Washington. "Be content with doing well what the times permit," he erroneously paraphrased Booker, which King said, and King now dismissed as cowardly resignation. At the same time, Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk became a primary text of the Black Studies movement in the late 1960s. The most influential other text of the Black Studies movement was the autobiography of Malcolm X. There are important parallels between Du Bois and Malcolm X. They were the leading influences in the development of black nationalism. Black nationalists embrace a history, often mythologic, about their common past as African people. They see whites as an enemy, and they exist in opposition to white power. Both Du Bois and Malcolm were anti-Semites, though each refrained from expressing it at the end of their lives. Both men articulated their oppositional ideology, but neither was an activist advancing a reform program in the way that Washington and King did. Du Bois did not actually lead in protest during the time that he and Washington shared the historical stage. He is often credited with founding the NAACP, but real responsibility for that lay with whites. The distortion of Washington's record, the distortions have created misunderstandings, I think, about black leadership. He has often been called conservative. Excuse me. Modern conservatives like this, but they misunderstand much about Washington. Washington's purpose was to change conditions for blacks. He was only conservative in his belief that business enterprise offered blacks their best opportunity to rise in America. Similarly, the frequent designation of Washington as an accommodationist to segregation is wrong. He worked too hard to resist segregation in various forms to say he accommodated it. Having conditions forced upon him with the threat of destruction, clearly the cost of resistance is not accommodation, it's coercion. The accommodation protest binary has obscured the similarity of the substance of Washington's action to the protest agenda put forward by the NAACP. The distortion of Washington's record has contributed to a narrowing of the limits Americans have put on black aspirations and black accomplishments. Led by Du Bois, historians confused the style and the substance of Booker Washington. Historians have shown an unfortunate narrow-mindedness about black leaders' styles. We should not hold black leaders to different standards of behavior from whites, but we historians have, To borrow the metaphors used by James McGregor Burns about Franklin Roosevelt, African American leaders must always be lions, like Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King. They cannot be foxes, else they will be accused of lacking manhood or resembling Richard Nixon. By the 1960s, understanding of the role of black leaders, understandably to some extent, was cast in the context of Martin Luther King's leadership, which suggested that blacks can only rise with direct action protest against the political order. To be sure, that accounted for King's great success, but as the role model for group advancement, it often doesn't work. Protest has yielded the desired results more episodically than consistently. Washington's emphasis on educational, moral, and economic development became virtually a lost artifact for Americans thinking about how to integrate disadvantaged groups. And this was ironic because his ideas, Washington's ideas, have inspired and instructed struggling people in the third world ever since he lived. Now let me, getting to the end, let me assess the relative successes of the leadership of Du Bois and Washington. Which man most shaped the thinking of his followers? Transformational leaders are said to offer followers something more than just working for self-gain. They provide followers with an inspiring mission and vision and give them an identity. Again, while the historical record denigrates Booker Washington's effort to try to motivate followers through his charisma, and while I think he offered people ways to challenge the status quo and to alter their environment, the circumstances of African Americans were really no better when he died in 1915 than they were when he became the leader in 1895. You have to, that's a realistic judgment, I think. I think it is clear that up to now, Du Bois has been more successful overall in leading the thinking of African Americans than Washington was. Washington's calculated vagueness about seeking racial equality enabled the misrepresentations of his ideas, whereas Du Bois's clarity about protest and his deep-seated hostility to white power have been vindicated by subsequent events. One may believe, as I do, that Washington inspired hope among blacks of his time and that he showed the only practical way to improving black conditions at the time, but that doesn't compare favorably with the achievements of the civil rights movement, which Du Bois's ideology directly upheld. We admire the leadership examples of Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, not just because they gave eloquent expression to democratic values, but also because amid terrible circumstances, their leadership shaped events that came out the way that leader wanted, winning the Civil War and winning World War II. Washington taught that economic uplift would ultimately bring the return of political rights. He promised that a black who acquired economic independence would command the respect of white neighbors, and ultimately with it would come the full rights of citizenship. But he did not acknowledge, not even privately, what was clear from the segregationist arguments against black industrial education, that whites objected to the rising status of a black skilled worker, or a black businessman, or a black landowner. For Washington to have conceded that whites would not reward black enterprise would have undermined his economic strategy altogether. There was no other realistic way for progress. However, at the time, neither politics nor protest worked in the South of 1901. Washington's effort to remake the black image in the white mind mostly failed during his lifetimes. His efforts would not overcome the intense political and cultural authority of white racism, But neither did the efforts of the NAACP in that regard until after World War II, when the demands of defeating racist enemies sparked the rejection of racial stereotypes in American culture. Washington should be recognized for anticipating the modern world, in which image was more readily manipulated than reality, where pessimism had little social utility. In the face of recurring failure, Washington did what any good public relations man does. He ignored the facts that did not fit his presentation of reality. He insisted that blacks would rise in status through education and economic success. Events after his death, I think, did vindicate him there. World wars, migrations, and an expanded national government brought economic opportunity that freed many blacks from the white South's hostility to black economic progress. But those events also brought about a better chance for political solutions, and it would be political action in the 1960s that ended segregation and disfranchisement. Successful leadership, of course, often depends on support during difficult times. Using the criterion for judging transformational leadership suggested by Bernard Bass, we must ask, did Washington and Du Bois, quote, garner trust, respect, and admiration from their followers? Du Bois always maintained that Washington was not popular among blacks, but was very popular among Southern whites. I think this is wrong, that the reality was more nearly the opposite. But it's a difficult thing to measure popularity when there were no polls taken. And to make my point, I'm going to take a poll right now. I'm going to ask all the people in this room who hold a PhD in history from the University of Tennessee to answer this question. Who is the most popular University of Tennessee football player in history? Now, Charlie Bryan? It would be Peyton Manning, and this was this was brought home a few weeks ago when the evil Alabama Crimson Tide came to Knoxville, and one of the commentators, football announcers, was in the crowd there outside Neyland Stadium before the game, and he told the audience on TV that night that he witnessed a woman jump up on the back of her truck to try to find her child in this big throng of people, and she shouted, "Peyton!" And 13 little boys ran up to her truck. So that's a maybe less scientific poll than the one I took earlier, but it makes the point. Evidence of Booker Washington's appeal to the rank and file of blacks has emerged, I think, in the naming practices of black Americans. Booker T became one of the most popular names for black male babies born after 1895. Several southern states had several hundred Booker T's born every year from 1895 to 1915. Most of them had the middle name T. But there were also 30 Booker T's born in Chicago, 24 in Detroit, and 20 in New York City in 1930. In the decades after 1915, 1,567 black male babies were born and named Booker T. In the 2007 Social Security Index, there are recorded 7,142 dead Bookers. 173 of them were named Booker T. Washington. And 117 of those were born after their namesake had died. During the same time, you find almost, and this you learned from Ancestry.com, during the same years, one scarcely finds one Du Bois and very few other famous black namesakes. I'm just saying. The other point is that public institutions across the United States used Booker Washington's name extensively to memorialize black achievement. for almost 2 generations after his death. Scores of schools, parks, community centers, libraries, and streets were named for Booker T. Washington. As public high schools for blacks were built for the first time in many southern communities in the 1920s and 30s, Booker T. Washington and his colleague George Washington Carver became the most likely name for black schools. In conclusion, let me say this. Like Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr., Booker Washington should be credited for exercising prophetic leadership. He told his people that they would endure the dark present, and as far as possible, he showed them how to survive by building an institution, Tuskegee Institute, that demonstrated blacks' potential for success and for autonomy. He gave them a symbol of progress and a reason to imagine a better future. That's what hope is, the ability to imagine a better future. Indeed, his life itself was an object lesson for progress. I didn't talk about how he came up. It's a remarkable story. And for hope that black people could rise to something better than they were at this awful time in American history around the turn of the 20th century. Even if he didn't succeed in his efforts to shape his own symbolism and that of blacks as a group, his life should be marked as a shrewd and valiant effort to help his people move up from history. Thank you. I never look at my watch, and that way I don't have to find out how much over I am, but in fact I got it about right. Now, let's have questions. Yes, sir, on the front row.
Sir, I think you've been very much
Okay.
your discussion of civil rights in the 60s and people of the I think the man who started civil rights in my country was President Harry Truman when he integrated most courageously the armed forces when he could never have passed this legislation through the United States Congress. Why is President Truman's courage in integrating the armed forces and the contribution that it made to civil rights always overlooked, including by you?
Well, my subject was black leadership, and
You started about the 1960s and you mentioned President Roosevelt.
yeah, okay. The question is about why Harry Truman is left out. Well, I think I left out a great many things out of this talk, but certainly and intend no slight to give him hell, Harry. But the fact is, Harry Truman didn't really give him hell on anything but desegregation of the armed forces. He didn't push a larger civil rights agenda. He was not effective enough in Congress to do what Lyndon Johnson later did. And I think it's a mixed record. To be sure, you're right about the armed forces.
First major step ever taken by a U.S. president other than Abraham Lincoln.
No, I don't think that's right. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt issued the 1941 order about economic fair hiring. So there are more than that. So I wouldn't agree with you about that. Truman's heart was in the right place, but he wasn't a very effective president, and I think that may go against what a lot of people want to believe, but he certainly wasn't on domestic issues. Next question. Yes, sir.
It seems you have presented the black leadership as a duality in that there's only one leader allowed at a time back at that turn of the century period. And I was wondering, is that what you are implying, that there would only be one leader of the race as seen in public opinion?
Well, that's what the historical record clearly showed to me, was that blacks, the Frederick Douglass was the pertinent model. And Frederick Douglass arose as the leader of black people, an escaped slave, an abolitionist, the man who really negotiated black rights with Abraham Lincoln and who spoke for it frankly afterward. So black people, after the Civil War, black people, had looked to him and essentially followed him mostly with unanimity. And so there was then, the Frederick Douglass model was that there should be a leader for black people to lead the whole race and to treat with white leadership as events arose. And, that's, I'm not justifying that. I mean, clearly it didn't absolutely have to be, but that's what the historical circumstance resulted in. And when he was essentially ordained as the leader of the race, there wasn't a whole lot of argument about it. Black people were just happy to have someone step forward as their spokesperson. There could have been others. It didn't necessarily have to be him, but he was the one who got the mantle. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I wonder if you could or would, for those who may not be acquainted with these two gentlemen, if you could say a little about where they came from or out of what they emerged onto the world stage.
Well, they had very different backgrounds. Du Bois was grew up in Western Massachusetts. He grew up in a much easier, freer environment. Of course, he was born free. He went to good schools and had essentially the same academic education that white kids had in Western Massachusetts. And then he went off and got a traditional college education, first at Fisk, and then he went to Harvard, and then earned a PhD at Harvard. So and by 1900, Du Bois is the most distinguished academic, really, black academic in the United States. Washington was born in slavery in 1856 out near Roanoke, Virginia. He was a slave until 1865. He didn't receive any education. His mother was illiterate. His father was white, but did not acknowledge him. He didn't get along with his stepfather. They moved to West Virginia. He worked in a really difficult circumstance at a salt mine, but he was always desperate to get an education, and ultimately, through the force of his own will, got one. But it was an education that was vastly inferior to what Du Bois got. And he graduated from Hampton with probably what would be today's equivalent of about a middle school education. But that just goes to show you, that a guy can rise a long way. He was, in my view, the most well-informed Southerner about Southern American and world events that existed in 1900 or 1905. But he was self-taught in all those fields. Does that get where you?
That's good. I just thought that might be illuminating for.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
This has to do with how I understood your characterization of when Du Bois broke from Washington. If I heard you correctly, it sounded like it was a very personal thing, that in some way he felt mistreated. I'm wondering if there's any more to it that you would say than that, because that certainly might account for a momentary thing, but this became the theme of the rest of his life.
Yeah, well, what I said was, this is not just me, David Lewis, Du Bois' biographer, says it was first personal over the issue of whether Washington supported Du Bois for a job that he wanted in Washington, D.C. Du Bois didn't get the job. he blamed Washington. The record does not really support Washington's being responsible for the failing to get the job, but nevertheless, Du Bois held it against him. And at the same time, Du Bois was mistreated on a railroad by white conductor, and Washington essentially came to his defense, helped to organize a campaign against the railroad, and then a lawsuit against the railroad. But the fact was, Du Bois had been humiliated, and Washington was the man in charge in terms of what the public thought about black people, and he blamed the guy in charge, and then I think Du Bois began to believe sincerely that Washington's leadership was wrong, and at some level Du Bois clearly believed that he should be the leader of the race, that he was better educated, and perhaps was better equipped to do the job, and with that he began to challenge Washington in various ways.
I never saw the two of them as a real conflict between them. And I see both of them are each with his own personality, one being Southern, perhaps saying a lot of things that he believed white people would want to hear him say, and Du Bois being a very well-educated person from Fisk, and the educational things that he wanted for African Americans as opposed to what Booker T wanted, which would be, he thought about agriculture and things that, vocational kinds of things for jobs for African Americans. And so it was that conflict more than anything else. Booker T wanted them to be educated, us to be educated, and I think Du Bois more or less said, we can be educated first and then do some of those things, whereas Booker T perhaps maybe wanted the vocational things, but some of the vocational things he talked about, they were almost outdated by the time he was talking about African Americans even getting those kinds of things. Another thing, Booker T, I think he more or less wanted people to, African Americans, to pull ourselves up, as we've heard, by bootstraps, but by that time, once African Americans began to do well, just like in Oklahoma, then what happened? They didn't want it. And so I look at each of those men with great respect because they each thought what was good for African Americans at that time.
Oh, let's hear from the young man.
Who was the better leader and why?
Who was the?
Who do you think was the better leader and why?
Well, as I said, I think Washington was the leader and should be credited for having been an astute and good leader during his life. But in terms of the long view, the long run of African American history, I think that Du Bois's protest ideology, his protest ideas were the ones that ultimately prevailed in the civil rights movement. You can't really compare because Washington didn't live to the civil rights period and Du Bois did. But, the overall judgment, I think, is for the long term, falls on Du Bois' side. Okay. One more? This man had a question.
I had heard that Washington basically was running a scam with his schools. He was talking about vocational education, and in fact, he had a lot more in mind than that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah. Washington had a curriculum that was essentially half academic and half vocational education. So half the time the students were in the classroom learning English and history and chemistry. The other half of the time they were learning trades. And you know, agriculture was part of that, but so were a lot of other trades that were applicable. They were not outdated altogether. So it wasn't a scam. I mean, people understand. In fact, Du Bois, who taught from time to time at Tuskegee, knew what the curriculum was. He taught history there. He knew it was half academic. He didn't choose to acknowledge that. But Washington was mainly training people to be teachers and businessmen. And to be a teacher, he said, you have to learn the academic. And these were mostly to be elementary, primary teachers in the rural South. You had to be able to teach the 3 R's, but you had to be able also to build a school, because most of the white South did not provide schools. And you needed to be able to organize a black community to help you build a school. And so it was, in a sense, Washington was teaching every student who came through Tuskegee to be a leader in a black community, and to then lead black people to a stronger economic position in American life, which he believed would come through capitalist enterprise. Okay.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Donaldson Forsyth. I'm a professor in the Jepson School of Leadership Studies. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out this evening and joining with us to discuss a difficult topic involving conflict, perhaps a time in America's past that many of us white Americans in particular are not familiar with. I know that when I was in high school, middle school, elementary school, we didn't cover this subject in any detail whatsoever. So it's difficult for us, however, to remember what America was like at the beginning of the 1900s, how difficult times were. Of course, we can celebrate that we've changed a great deal over the years, but there's still work to be done with regards to inequality, racism, tension and conflict between the races. So we might be tempted to rest on our laurels, but we shouldn't stop too soon. History teaches us that lesson. As you know, this is the third and final presentation in the Conflict Forum series for this year, for 2014, but coming in 2015, we have 3 more planned for you. Let me just mention those if I could. In January, we will have an anthropologist, Polly Wiesner, coming from the University of Utah to discuss conflict in small-scale societies, in indigenous cultures, perhaps touching on the question of human nature. Are we by nature cooperative as a species, or perhaps more prone to conflict? I suppose after tonight's presentation, we're leaning in the conflict direction, as it turns out. In February, we'll have a visitor from Florida State University. Dr. Roy Baumeister will be coming. He's a psychologist. He's going to be talking about what some have suggested is the longest conflict of all time. The so-called battle of the sexes, the conflict which sometimes emerges between men and women in many different contexts and situations. And then in March, singer-songwriter Dar Williams will be coming. She teaches courses at Wesleyan in Connecticut, and she'll be speaking. She'll be in part performing some of her works, but she will be discussing conflict and protest. For more information about any of these events, of course, we have a lovely website which you can visit. We also have probably brochures out there in the lobby. Speaking of the lobby, we have copies of Dr. Norrell's book, Up From History, available for purchase, and we'll out in the lobby probably also have Dr. Norrell available to sign those copies as well. We've come to the end of this evening's program, and we're ready to adjourn to the gallery just outside this room for a reception. But before we do that, would you please join me in thanking one more time Dr. Norrell. Have a good evening.